Hello. I'm not texting, I'm just going to time myself so I keep to the 19 minutes and 59 seconds that I'm supposed to keep to. Thanks very much for the introduction. I still get a few chills in my back when I hear the titles. I'm not used to it, but thank you, it was nice. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to speak to an issue that I'm very passionate about, and the very issue that brought me into the world of research around 15 years ago when I started working on social exclusion, inequalities, and so on. And then over the years I've been focusing mostly on issues around civic engagement, civic participation, and community engagement. And now I'm working on bringing those worlds together, the world of inequalities and participation. And I just want to put to you a few ideas and a few provocations and a few examples and see what that might mean to you. And I'm going to try and offer a little bit of what I think could be considerations into how to apply all of this to your work as CLD practitioners. As Ashley mentioned, I work for What Works Scotland, which is a mouthful, especially with my South Edinburgh accent. What Works Scotland is there to improve public services, use evidence, use research, and work with communities, public services, third sector, and so on to make better policies, improve public services. And it's been interesting over the last few months, perhaps year or so, how inequalities has become mainstream again. And I say that because these things come and go in waves. But at the moment, it seems to be a central issue in policy agendas in Scotland, UK, and beyond. Partly because some academics have been very skillful at creating bestsellers that capture people's imaginations. You might be familiar with The Spirit Level or with the work by Danny Darling on injustice. And my concern is with the relationship between participation, community engagement, and inequalities. Inequalities in health, income, wealth, education, stemming from inequalities of power and influence. That means, the way I see it, and then we might discuss that, but the way I see it, a lot of the other inequalities, a lot of the inequalities of income, wealth, health, and so on, stem or originate from inequalities of power. A very small elite get to make decisions on public services, on public expenditure, on how we run our lives, on how we govern our communities. And to me, that then means that the voices of those who are not at that segment of the population, that tiny percentage, literally 0.1% that runs our society. And because those voices are not represented, we never get to really tackle some of those pressing issues. And that's not just in terms of inequalities, but in terms of some of the biggest concerns. How do we make our public services sustainable? How do we care for the environment? How do we create vibrant communities and build on local assets to develop their own capacity and their own aspiration? And over the last few years, participation has become very fashionable. There has been an industry of participation around the world with some really worrying developments in places like the United States, where there's a huge industry, and you will go to a public meeting and it will be sponsored by Google and Apple, and there are all sorts of things happening there. We're not seeing that here so much. Most of the kind of consultation, participation, community engagement is often led by officials, local authorities, third sector organizations, and so on. But there is something really intriguing. There is a paradox. At the same time, we have this growing participation, and at the same time, we have declining democracy. And that's across the Western world. And some argue that what we have is a more participatory social style. Yeah, you click on that star when you buy an Amazon product, and you do all those kind of social participation elements as a consumer and so on. But not necessarily the same level of participation when it comes to government policy making, public services. And another paradox is that over the last 50 years, I'm a political scientist by training, but I don't get too hung up on numbers, although sometimes they are useful. And we can see that over the last few years, there's ever-growing participation, ever-growing toolkits for community engagement, ever-growing consultations, ever-growing participatory budgeting processes, deliberative engagement processes, and so on. And yet, there are ever-growing inequalities. And some may argue, and I think I agree with them, that a lot of the public participation, a lot of the community engagement that we do has been depoliticized. Values and worldviews and the clashes between viewpoints have been taken out, and community engagement too often has become very extractive, very market research-like. And it's given place to that kind of designer democracy that has little to do with a more participatory democracy. We have plenty of tools for community engagement, but not necessarily many processes that actually seek social transformation. And what I would argue is what we lack. We have too much participation, we should have less, but it should be empowered and deliberative. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by that in a second. But it's important to remember that what's happening is that the role of citizens and the image that citizens have of themselves, the communities have of themselves, is evolving. Decision makers face really complex issues, and increasingly we need to ask the question, who is going to help those decision makers to make those difficult decisions, work out the trade-offs, and so on. And you could think, okay, yeah, surely experts can help them. But experts also have biases and values and so on. So if it comes down to values, why should it be left to experts? The argument being that we need to open it up to communities and citizens and to devolve power so that things can be decided more bottom up. Some people explain this new level of civic aspiration but they still say, well, but actually there is declining trust, we don't trust public institutions, the level of turnout in elections keeps going down. Okay, let's put in brackets the referendum and what's going on in Scotland just now, but all predictions are that in a few years we'll just be back to where other countries are. There are others who say, actually, no, we are making progress. What we have is citizens that are more critical, less prepared to let others speak for them, less deferential to authority, and more suspicious of those who claim to speak on their behalf. And yet, we have built a democracy of intermediaries. Very often what we have is people who speak for, so representatives from the third sector and so on. And for me, it comes down to this question. What kind of citizens are we inviting citizens to be? Are we inviting them to be spectators, bystanders, complainers, protesters, voters? A lot of the current community engagement processes allocate those type of roles to citizens. And then we're surprised that people turn up on a wet Wednesday evening, there are more officials than community members in the room, and it all ends up in a shouting match. And it's just because that's the role that often people are given. Instead of being given a more meaningful role, as they were given in the referendum, or they are given in some participatory budgeting processes and so on, as co-producers, deliberative participants, decision makers. And none of this is really new. In 1984, Barber was already trying to capture a whole lot of initiatives and so on from the 60s, and those of you familiar with the community education tradition in the States and in the UK will be familiar with this. But it's that old idea that in a participatory democracy, citizens govern themselves directly. Not necessarily at every level or every time. People are busy and we all have lives and it's difficult to commit time, but frequently enough so that you feel that you're having a real impact in the decisions that are being taken. And also that institutions are designed to involve citizens. One of my worries after the referendum was, okay, so people have gone through this period of extraordinary democracy. And now they turn up to the next consultation process expecting that level of engagement, dialogue, deliberation. What they are going to find is something very, very different because our institutions are not prepared for that level of extraordinary democracy. Increasingly, we are also concerned that traditional forms of community engagement mobilize the like-minded and mobilize only certain parts of the population. And very often what you end up with in a consultation process, in a community engagement process, is a wish list, an uncritical wish list that very often doesn't really respond to the community's needs and so on. And there is a huge issue around uninformed participation and the voices of the loudest being heard the most. And that's why increasingly we talk about moving towards deliberative participation. In deliberation, the emphasis is on diversity and difference. If you don't have the full spectrum of the debate in the room, then you're not being deliberative. The emphasis is on the quality of interaction, and the emphasis is on evidence and the role that evidence needs to play. And evidence not just in the academic sense, but in the sense also of local knowledge, experiential knowledge, and so on. And therefore, deliberative democracy is based on that idea that decision-making should be based on reasoned public debate, where no force other than arguments should win the day. I'm not going to go through this, but in essence, it's a democracy that is not just about counting heads. It's about trying to work out how to respond to some of the pressing issues of our time. And I just want to, can I get you all to stand up just for a second, please? So now think about that question. Have you participated in a public forum to discuss policy or community issues in the last 3 months? If you have, please stay standing. If you haven't, please sit down. Okay. Now, stay standing if, at that forum, there was a reasonable gender balance. So you can sit down. Stay standing if there was a mix of personal and professional backgrounds. Ooh, this is scary. Stay standing if there were a range of perspectives and opinions, even those who are difficult to be heard and who might not be like-minded. Stay standing if there was an age range, 3 generations under one roof. So we have around 10 people standing. How about, was there a sense that most participants felt influential and included? Yeah, good, good, good. Was there a sense that participants enjoyed it? They enjoyed taking part in that forum. Okay, so there are still a few left, and those are, if talking about best practice, there we have some. And how about, was there a sense that their participation will have a clear impact? Okay, so in a room of, what, 90 people, 100 people or so, we have 3 people standing. Thank you, you can sit now. The point is that we still face some really, really difficult challenges when we set up community development processes, community engagement processes. We face the issue of inclusion and diversity. We're not good at really creating a microcosm of our community and having that in the room represented. Often we also struggle with creating that kind of quality of dialogue and deliberation. The kind of conversation that takes on the difficult issues, tries to be evidence-informed in some way, tries to take into account the perspectives of everyone, and tries to define some sense of the common good, what could be good for this community. And then, most importantly, and the issue that keeps coming up time and again, a lot of these community engagement processes, community participation processes lack a clear link to policy and decision-making, and therefore an impact. But there are things happening all around the world, and that includes Scotland, of course, where people are trying out new ways of overcoming some of those issues. Some of the pictures there are the Canadian Citizens' Assemblies on electoral reform, or the institutional process in Iceland, or citizens' duties in Birmingham, Kerala, India, or the European Union Synthetic Biology Dialogue. There are all sorts of democratic innovations that you can check out in Participedia, the Wikipedia for participatory nerds, which I invite you to check. Now, PB, participatory budgeting, is becoming really popular in Scotland, and I find myself bringing back this slide from some of the presentations I used to do some years ago, just to remind us of what PB actually achieved in Porto Alegre and to set a high standard for how we develop PB in Scotland. The core to the Porto Alegre model is that it managed to shift resources and public investment to tackle health and social inequalities like no other policy that I've come across has managed to do. And that's been going on for around 25 years. I bring some of the data from the first decade because it's the best known, and I'll just put it up there on the screen without going into the detail. But you can see the theme is increased housing, increased expenditure on health, improved infrastructure, schools, and so on, with up to sometimes around 15,000 to 17,000 participants, and especially disadvantaged groups, so those seldom heard, those easily ignored, are often those who most participate and benefit from the PB model that was developed in Brazil. And now this is troubling, and there are 2,500 cases around the world of PB, some of them in Scotland. In Paris, for instance, it has been announced they are going to allocate 500 million euros through PB in the next 5 years. And then you have, some of you might have heard me talk about mini publics, some of these democratic innovations that try to make spaces where a cross-section of the community comes together to talk through an issue and make some recommendations or sometimes decisions. The emphasis is on equalities, so actually instead of sending an open call out there, which often attracts those from higher income and higher education, in particular sections of the population in terms of race, ethnicity, and so on. In mini publics, the barriers to participation are lowered by doing a range of things. Sometimes it's random selection, selection by lot, as we used to do in ancient Greece or medieval Venice. Sometimes it's by paying an stipend for people to come and work with us so that the 18-year-old mother of four on benefits can come along, get childcare and help to do that civic work, or the full-time self-employed person, or the full-time caterer, so lowering the barriers to participation so the people in the room are really reflective of the variety of perspectives in society. And then it generates decisions and recommendations. A recent example is the Melbourne case, where 43 citizens randomly selected from the city to represent the city in terms of gender, ethnicity, age, income, and perspectives as well, viewpoints, ideological perspectives. And they were brought together to create a 10 years financial plan amounting to $5 billion. So these things are happening. And out of the 21 recommendations, 19 were taken up by the City Council, and they are being implemented as we speak. And then, if we want a less local case, often many of these things are local by default, but there are national level cases as well. Many of us in this room, I'm sure, celebrated the passing of the Marriage Equality Act in 2015 in Ireland, a milestone for Ireland, but more globally as well. And because sometimes we forget that that is not the common thing in most countries around the world. What we often forget is that that issue was not put on the agenda by politicians or by pressure groups. That issue was put on the agenda by a randomly selected, citizen-led constitutional convention of the kind I've just mentioned, a mini public of that sort. And they put in their recommendations to have a referendum on that act, and then it passed. So these things are having an impact. We have a recent report that I will recommend if you're interested in some of these innovations. We did an experiment with 3 citizens' juries on the topic of wind farms in Scotland, how they affect communities, and how community organizers, community development officers, and so on can facilitate these kind of processes. And I just want to conclude thinking about what does this mean for CLD practice? Can at least some CLD practitioners tap into that tradition of community organizing that we can trace back when the profession was born, and kind of rekindle that role as facilitators, mediators, democratic innovators in our communities? And this is not easy. This is a slide from some colleagues down in Birmingham who try to map what might mean to be that kind of public servant in the 21st century. And you have to do all these different things, to be a resource weaver, a storyteller, a commissioner, a broker, an entrepreneur, a networker. It's not easy. It does require a particular mindset, and it requires constant learning, and no one is perfect. No one can do all of these things at the same time, so it's best done as a team, and yet a lot of CLD teams across the country have been, as far as I'm aware, have been reduced to their bare minimum, and in some places have even disappeared. If you were to think about, so what do I do in an interview if I want to get some of these CLD practitioners to become democratic innovators? What kind of things do they need to do? This is what I have learned from the research, and I'm sure there are other things I'm forgetting. But they do need to be good at developing this kind of new publics, diverse, with a focus on overcoming inequalities, with a focus on representing the views of a cross-section of the population, and so on. And that is not easy, because it's not part, sometimes, of the tradition and the way we teach, and universities are pretty guilty of this, although we are trying to change it. They need to be good at doing political work, and that might feel uncomfortable. But by politics, I don't mean party politics. By politics, I mean the kind of work that reshapes a particular social world, a particular community, the kind of work that is value-driven and tries to make a difference. We need to rescue politics and give it again a good name. It's not just party politics. And to do that, actually, you need to be good at negotiating, nudging, nagging, cajoling, pressing, persuading, reframing, aligning, trapping, enticing, enthusing, concealing, disclosing, unleashing, connecting. You need to be good mediators. You need to be good facilitators of dialogue and deliberation. Many of these things come naturally to you. You do it on a daily basis anyway, but I want to emphasize it. The reflective practitioner, a recurring theme, but also the building relational capital, especially with those that you don't get on well with. And that is difficult, to strike those unlikely alliances, to bring about a new community engagement process that tries to make a difference, that tries to solve a problem, that tries to create a more vibrant community or develop institutions and services that help to improve well-being. Being a knowledge broker, information, evidence, crucial, and we need to keep trying to include as much of the evidence as possible. And again, evidence is not just academic evidence, it's the very things that you develop as you work with people in communities and the knowledge that you manage to develop. And then that local and political knowledge. And I'll conclude by saying that some of these democratic innovations that I've been kind of throwing at you, just as a provocation to show you things that are of a really huge scale and to say, well, you know, there are virtually no limits to some of these things. But actually, we do need to develop a homegrown kind of approach. And it's not just about importing, we need to translate those things. Then we also need to understand better how these new forms of local democracy, community-driven democracy, may collide, coalesce, collude with existing institutions and the role of representatives, elected members in all of this. Sometimes that takes institutional reform. Capacity building, I've already mentioned it, and facilitative leadership. The kind of leadership that says, I'm not a traditional leader that knows the direction of travel, follow me to the mountain, that kind of thing. But I'm the kind of leader who is someone who knows how to bring people together around a table or a community hall and have some difficult conversations to make things happen. It needs to be both empowered, that means there has to be something at stake. There has to be some real power sharing. It needs to be deliberative, as in informed, representative of the views across the community and so on. And we need to be careful and connect these things to our democratic system so that they don't become isolated processes that then no one listens to and do not make it to the city council or to the town or to the council chambers. And finally, you might be thinking, yes, but this is expensive. How do we fund all of this? How do we develop these new capacities? Some of them, I would argue, I mean, most of you in this room, those of you who work on the ground, this will not be new to you, but there will be needs for new capacity building programs in some of these processes. What I would say is we need to do less consultation, less community engagement. Let's stop some of those 1,000 consultations that go on at any given time in Scotland, and let's just focus on the issues that people really want to be engaged with. And then the resources will make sense. It's the quality over quantity, the high-stakes issues, and focused on developing the kind of democratic participation that might mean something, that might be meaningful and consequential. Thank you.